My name is Cassie Langford, and I have spent the last 7 years of my life measuring time in milligrams and heartbeats. I am a trauma nurse, a profession that teaches you to expect the unexpected, to stay calm when the monitors start screaming, and to look for the hidden bleed. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for the sight of my sister, Morgan, standing on my porch on a Tuesday morning in October. She wasn't alone. She was wearing a black designer dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage and standing next to a man in a sharp gray suit who held a leather briefcase like a weapon. Morgan didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask about the funeral we'd held just 2 weeks ago, the one she conveniently missed. She looked me dead in the eye, past the dark circles under my eyes and the faded scrubs I was still wearing from a double shift, and she said 6 words that turned my grief into a cold, hard rage. I'm here to contest the will. The man beside her, Nathan Driscoll, adjusted his silk tie and cleared his throat. He spoke in that polished, rhythmic tone lawyers use when they're about to take something from you. My client believes there are grounds for undue influence, Ms. Langford. She believes the estate, specifically this house, was promised to her. This house. The one our father, Silas, built with his own 2 hands, stone by stone, overlooking the jagged cliffs of the Oregon coast. It's valued at $415,000, but to me, it's the place where I watched our mother breathe her last and where I held my father's hand as his heart finally gave out. Morgan hadn't stepped foot on this property in 7 years. She hadn't sent a card. She hadn't answered a single one of my desperate texts when the doctors gave us the bad news. And yet, there she was, standing on the threshold of a home she abandoned, claiming she was the one being robbed. She didn't know that Silas Langford was a master shipbuilder, a man who accounted for every nail, every board, and every penny. She didn't know that while she was busy erasing us from her life, my father was busy preparing for this exact moment. And all I needed was one piece of paper to bring her entire world crashing down. But before I show you what was in that envelope, you need to understand exactly why she left. The night the bridge burned was a Thursday in October, exactly 7 years ago. The air inside the house smelled like garlic and rosemary, my mother's traditional pot roast dinner. It's a scent that used to mean safety, but now it only reminds me of the end. My father sat at the head of the table, a man made of oak and iron, his hands scarred from decades in the shipyard. My mother was across from him, already looking frail, though we didn't know why yet. I was to his left, and Morgan was to his right. She hadn't touched a single bite of her food. Instead, she had a manila folder on the table, and inside was a printout from a real estate site. Our house. Our home. There was a number circled in red ink, $415,000. Morgan looked at my father, her voice devoid of any warmth. Sell it, she said. Split the money. I need $200,000 to start over. She'd just finalized a messy divorce in the city. Her credit cards were maxed, her lifestyle was collapsing, and she decided that our parents' retirement was her personal safety net. My father didn't raise his voice. He simply set his fork down with a deliberate click against the china. This house isn't for sale, Morgan. It's the only thing your mother and I have left. Morgan's eyes flashed with a resentment that had been brewing for years. It's just walls and wood, Dad. It's an asset. You're sitting on a fortune while I'm drowning. My mother reached across the table to take Morgan's hand, a silent plea for peace, but Morgan pulled away as if she'd been burned. If you won't help me when I'm down, then I have nothing left to say to any of you. She pushed back from the table so hard the chair nearly tipped. She grabbed her keys and walked toward the front door. My mother started crying, that quiet, apologetic sob that broke my heart every time. At the door, Morgan turned around. She wasn't looking at the parents she was abandoning. She was looking at me. You're going to rot in this house taking care of them, she hissed. And nobody will ever thank you. You're the good daughter, Cassie. Let's see how much that's worth when they're gone. The screen door slammed, her headlights swept across the dark yard, and she vanished. I cleared her untouched plate and washed it in silence. My father sat at the table for an hour without moving. That was the last time we saw her. For the first year after she left, I was the one who tried. I called every week, it went straight to voicemail. I sent texts, letters, and Christmas cards to her last known address in Seattle. They all came back unopened. Then, the second year hit like a rogue wave. My mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. I remember sitting in that oncologist's office, the plastic chair squeaking every time I breathed, feeling the world tilt on its axis. My mother held my hand and whispered, "Don't tell your sister. She has enough on her plate." I told her anyway. I left 3 voicemails. I sent an express letter with the medical reports attached. Nothing. I rearranged my entire life. I traded my full-time hospital shifts for a grueling schedule at a local clinic so I could drive her to chemo 40 miles away. I became an expert in nausea medications and medical line maintenance. I learned the names of every nurse on the oncology ward and packed bags of saltine crackers for the long rides home. My mother fought for 2 years. She died on a Sunday morning in March, in the bedroom she'd shared with my father for 43 years. I was holding her left hand, Dad was holding her right. We were a broken circle. 47 people came to her funeral, neighbors, her bridge club, the woman from the bakery who always saved her the day-old sourdough. It was a testament to a life well lived in a small town. But Morgan wasn't one of them. She didn't even send flowers. My father sat in the front pew, his jaw set so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He didn't mention her name once that day. But when we got home and he went to the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, I saw his hands shaking. He looked at the empty chair where Morgan used to sit, and then he looked at the old metal file cabinet in the corner of the den. He didn't say anything, but that night, for the first time, I heard the sound of a key turning in a lock and the rhythmic shuffle of paper. It went on until dawn. I assumed it was just his way of processing the grief, of sorting through a life that had suddenly become much smaller. I didn't realize he was starting a ledger. And I certainly didn't realize that the first entry in that ledger was a date and a dollar amount that would eventually change everything if I could only find where he hid the key. The pews of the Grace Coastal Chapel were filled with the scent of lilies and the damp wool of overcoats. 47 people. I counted them because I needed something to hold on to besides the crushing weight of the casket. There was Doris from next door, her husband Frank, and even the postman who had delivered my mother's medical bills for 2 years with a sympathetic nod. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking tribute to Linda Langford. But the one face that should have been in the front row, the one with the same blue eyes and stubborn chin, was nowhere to be found. Morgan was a ghost, a name we didn't speak, a void that sat between my father and me like an unexploded landmine. My father, Silas, sat beside me, his shoulders straight, his jaw set in a line of weathered iron. He held my hand during the final hymn, and for a moment, I felt the tremors through his palm. He wasn't just grieving a wife, he was mourning a family that had been amputated. When we returned to the house that afternoon, the silence was absolute. Silas didn't go to the porch to watch the waves. He went straight to the kitchen table, pulled out that old metal file cabinet, and began to write. I watched him from the hallway, his small, careful block lettering filling up a ledger page. I thought it was just a hobby of grief, a way to account for a life that had suddenly become too quiet. I had no idea that while I was mourning the sister I lost, my father was building a case against the daughter who had abandoned him. The diagnosis came 14 months later, delivered in the same sterile office where we'd learned about Mom. Congestive heart failure. The cardiologist explained it like a math problem, fluid, pressure, percentages, but as a nurse, I didn't need the equations. I knew the trajectory. My father's heart, the one that had powered him through 40 years of shipbuilding, was finally giving out. The iron was rusting. I did what I'd always done, I showed up. I moved my life into the guest room permanently. I managed his medications, cooked the low-sodium meals he grumbled about with a wink, and slept with my door ajar so I could hear the rhythm of his oxygen concentrator. But as his body failed, his mind seemed to sharpen, focused on a single, mysterious task. Every Wednesday, while I ran to the pharmacy, our neighbor Doris would sit with him on the porch. One afternoon, I returned to find them whispering, their heads huddled over a stack of bank statements. Doris looked up, her eyes wide. "You're a saint, Cassie," she said, her voice trembling. Most daughters would have folded by now. Silas just squeezed her hand and looked at me with a gaze that was both loving and terrifyingly final. He began making secret phone calls to Gerald Marsh, the most feared estate attorney on the coast. When I asked him why a shipbuilder needed a lawyer, he just tapped the ledger on the table. "I'm making sure the keel is straight, Cassie," he whispered. "Before the ship sets sail." The rumors started in the third year, drifting through the local grocery store like a cold fog. My cousin Lisa pulled me aside near the dairy aisle, her voice a poisonous stage whisper. "People are talking, Cassie. They say you're nursing for the deed. They say you've got Silas under a spell, keeping Morgan away so you can inherit the whole cliffside." I felt the blood drain from my face. I was working 60-hour weeks between the clinic and the house, lifting a grown man into the shower, and counting every breath he took, and the town saw a gold digger. I didn't defend myself. I couldn't. I just drove home and sat in the driveway, staring at the house Silas had built. Was I staying for love, or was I staying because I had nowhere else to go? Morgan's words from 7 years ago, "You're going to rot in this house," echoed in my mind. But then I walked inside and saw Silas. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his breathing labored, but his pen was moving steadily across the ledger. He looked at me, and for a split second, the iron returned to his eyes. "They don't know the math, Cassie," he rasped, tapping the paper. "They only see the wood. They don't see the debt." He slid a small, silver key across the table toward me, his hand shaking violently. "Keep this safe. Don't open the cabinet until the storm hits the door. You'll know when." He died 3 days later, leaving me with a house full of ghosts and a key to a secret that was about to turn my sister's greed into her greatest nightmare. Silas died at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. It was exactly 7 years and 2 days since Morgan had slammed that screen door and disappeared into the neon hum of a life we weren't invited to. I was sitting beside him, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator the only pulse left in the room. His breathing had shifted around midnight, heavy, jagged pauses that stretched longer and longer, as if his soul was a ship testing the anchor before finally breaking for the open sea. As a nurse, I'd heard that sound 100 times, but when it's your father, the clinical knowledge doesn't numb the silence that follows. His last exhale was quiet, a long, weary sigh that seemed to take the last of the house's warmth with it. I didn't call the funeral home right away. I sat there for 10 minutes, watching the moonlight crawl across his scarred hands. His coffee mug was still on the nightstand, half full and stone cold. I didn't cry then, I just felt the weight of the silver key in my pocket, pulling at me like a lead weight. I spent the next 3 days planning the service alone. I picked the white lilies he loved, sorted through his closet for the one navy suit he owned, and wrote an obituary that focused on the bridges he'd built and the ships he'd launched. I didn't try to find Morgan. Her old email bounced, her phone was a disconnected ghost, and honestly, I couldn't bear the thought of her silence being the last thing my father felt. I buried him on a gray morning with 40 neighbors standing in the rain, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt like the only captain left on a sinking ship. The reading of the will took place in Gerald Marsh's office, a wood-paneled room above the hardware store that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. Gerald was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same coastal cedar as my father, weathered, sturdy, and impossibly sharp. He laid a folder on the desk and looked at me over his reading glasses. "Your father was very specific, Cassie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He left the house, the land, and all associated assets to you. Full, unconditional ownership." I felt a phantom weight lift off my chest, but then I remembered the shadow in the room. And Morgan? I asked. Gerald turned the page, a grim smile touching his lips. To Morgan, he left a bequest of exactly $1. I blinked, the number sounding like a mistake. $1? Gerald nodded. It's a deliberate legal provision. By naming her and giving her a nominal amount, he proved that he didn't forget her. He intentionally excluded her. It makes the will almost impossible to overturn on the basis of a clerical error. He then slid a cream-colored envelope across the desk. It was heavy, sealed with the same reinforced tape my father used to waterproof his blueprints. My name was written on the front in his unmistakable, blocky handwriting. He told me to give you this only if the storm hits, Gerald whispered. Only if she comes back for the wood and the stone. If she doesn't show, you're to burn it unopened. I tucked the envelope into my bag, feeling the crackle of the paper, wondering if I'd ever have the heart to destroy my father's final words. The storm didn't take long to break. 2 weeks after the funeral, the digital world did what the real world couldn't, it brought my sister back. My cousin Lisa sent me a link to a public social media post that was already trending in our small coastal town. Morgan had launched a scorched earth campaign, her profile filled with high-resolution photos of her grieving on a beach, captioned with poisonous lies. My father passed and I wasn't even told, one post read. My sister isolated him in his final years, manipulated his failing mind, and stole the home he promised to me. She chose a house over her own flesh and blood. The comments were a bloodbath. Hundreds of strangers were calling me a predator, a leech, and a toxic gatekeeper. People who had never met Silas Langford were demanding justice for Morgan. I sat at the kitchen table, the very one where I'd fed him every meal, and watched my reputation be dismantled in real time by a woman who hadn't even known his heart was failing. Then came the final blow, a notification from a law firm in the city. Morgan wasn't just venting online, she was suing for undue influence, claiming Silas was mentally incompetent when he signed the deed over to me. My hands were shaking, the anger hot and electric in my throat. I looked at the kitchen drawer where I'd hidden the cream envelope. The internet was screaming, the lawyers were circling, and the sister who had vanished was now at my gates with a torch. The storm hadn't just hit the door, it was threatening to tear the whole house off the cliff. I reached for the envelope, my thumb catching on the seal, knowing that whatever was inside was the only thing that could stop the fire. Or fuel it forever. The phone call came on a Friday morning, the kind of polished, frictionless voice that usually belongs to people who sell luxury cars or high-yield bonds. Nathan Driscoll. My sister's attorney. He didn't lead with a greeting, he led with a maneuver. Ms. Langford, my client would prefer to resolve this amicably. She is prepared to offer a private settlement before we file the formal petition for undue influence. She understands that your father's cognitive state in those final 18 months was, shall we say, flexible. Flexible. That was the word they were going to use to describe the man who still corrected my grammar 2 days before he died. My father was sharp enough to know who was holding his hand and who was ignoring his calls. Mr. Driscoll, I said, my voice as cold as the Pacific spray against the cliffs. But Driscoll didn't flinch. He told me the internet was already on Morgan's side, that the public narrative was set, and that a long, expensive court battle would bleed the estate dry anyway. He suggested an in-person meeting. At the house. He wanted Morgan to see the assets she was being robbed of. I looked at the cream envelope sitting on the counter, the seal still intact. Fine, I said. Bring her. Bring the paperwork. But tell her to wear sensible shoes. The cliffs aren't kind to people who don't know the terrain. The memorial gathering for Silas was supposed to be a quiet affair, a way for the shipyard guys and the neighbors to swap stories over Doris's apple cake. But by 11 o'clock, the atmosphere had shifted. The house was full of 28 people who had watched me carry groceries and oxygen tanks for years, but there was a shadow at the door. When the doorbell rang, the room went dead silent, the kind of silence that precedes a structural failure. I opened the door to find Morgan in a black dress, oversized sunglasses hiding eyes I knew were scanning the room for the highest value antiques. She didn't come in like a mourner, she came in like an auditor. Driscoll was behind her, clutching his leather briefcase like a shield. Morgan walked straight to the mantel, looked at the photos of our father, and spoke loud enough for every neighbor to hear. "I would have been here for him," she said, her voice cracking with a practiced, melodic grief. "But I was told he didn't want to see me. I was told I wasn't welcome in my own childhood home." A murmur rippled through the room. I saw Frank from the shipyard furrow his brow. I saw the doubt flicker in the eyes of the people who hadn't been there at 4 o'clock when the breathing stopped. Morgan was performing for an audience she'd already primed online, and for a second, the good daughter narrative I'd lived felt like it was dissolving into the salt air. "I'm not here for the cake, Cassie," Morgan hissed as we moved into the kitchen, the rest of the guests hovering in the hallway like a jury. She stood in the center of the room, the same spot where she'd demanded the house 7 years ago. "I'm here for my half. This house is valued at $415,000. You've had 7 years of free rent while I struggled. You manipulated a dying man into signing a paper that erases his own flesh and blood." She turned to the room, her voice rising. "Did any of you see the will? Did any of you see him sign it? Or did you just see Cassie whispering in his ear while he was too weak to fight back?" Driscoll stepped forward, clicking open his briefcase. He pulled out a document. "The formal notice of intent to contest. We are prepared to prove that Silas Langford lacked testamentary capacity," he said, his voice echoing against the white oak cabinet Silas had built. "We are suggesting a 50-50 split of the property value to avoid a public scandal." Morgan looked at me, a triumphant, jagged smile playing on her lips. She thought she'd won. She thought the audience, the lawyer, and the undue influence claim were enough to make me buckle. She didn't realize that Silas hadn't just built a house, he'd built a trap. I reached for the cream envelope tucked under my mother's old cookbook. "You want to talk about investments, Morgan?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You want to talk about what's fair? Then let's look at the receipts. Because Dad didn't just leave a will. He left a ledger." I broke the seal on the envelope, the sound of the reinforced tape tearing like a gunshot in the silent kitchen. The sound of the reinforced tape tearing was the only noise in the kitchen. Morgan's smug expression didn't falter, not yet. She watched my hands with the detached curiosity of someone who believed they were holding all the cards. I pulled out 2 handwritten pages in my father's small, block letters and 6 pages of bank transfer records, each one stamped, dated, and notarized. These weren't just papers, they were the blueprints of a debt Morgan had spent 7 years trying to outrun. "You want to talk about undue influence, Morgan? You want to tell these people I manipulated a dying man?" I stepped closer, placing the records on the white oak table Silas had built for us. "Dad didn't just leave a will. He left a paper trail. Between the ages of 22 and 30, he sent you 14 separate bank transfers. Credit card bailouts, your divorce attorney fees, personal loans you never intended to repay." I pointed to the number underlined twice in blue ink at the bottom of the second page, $218,000. "That is more than half the value of this house. You didn't lose your inheritance, Morgan. You spent it before Mom was even diagnosed. You ate your share of this house years ago, and Dad kept the receipts." The room went rigid. Nathan Driscoll leaned in, his professional mask slipping as he scanned the notarized stamps. This wasn't a flexible cognitive state. It was a cold, hard accounting. I turned to the final page, the letter Silas had written 18 months before he died. My voice stayed level, the same steady tone I used when delivering bad news to a patient's family. I read his words aloud. "I loved both my daughters equally, but love isn't blind. I sent Morgan $218,000. She never once asked how I was paying for it. The house isn't a reward for Cassie. It's me making sure the daughter who stayed always has a roof, because the other one already sold hers. The truth hit the room like a physical weight. Morgan wasn't a victim of a toxic family. She was a financial vampire who had drained the estate while Silas was still alive. Then, I reached into the file cabinet and pulled out the red shoebox. I opened it to reveal 33 years of birthday cards, every single one I had ever given him, arranged in chronological order. He had saved every "I love you, Dad" I'd ever whispered, every "I'm glad I'm here" I'd written during the long nights of his heart failure. It was the proof that Silas hadn't been coerced. He had been observant. He had seen the sacrifice in every meal I cooked and every shift I traded. Morgan's lawsuit didn't just collapse, it evaporated in the heat of the truth. The aftermath was a quiet, clinical victory. Within 72 hours, Driscoll's office sent a formal withdrawal of the contest. The bank records, combined with the doctor's verification of Silas's mental clarity, left them with no foundation to stand on. The social narrative shifted just as quickly. When the town learned about the debt, the outraged comments turned into a deafening silence. Morgan tried to call me one last time, 3 weeks later. There were no lawyers this time, just the sound of traffic and a voice that sounded small, stripped of its armor. She didn't apologize. She asked if I could loan her $5,000 to cover her mounting legal fees. I didn't scream. I didn't gloat. I simply looked out at the Pacific, watching the waves grind the rocks into sand. "I'm not carrying your plate anymore, Morgan," I said, and I hung up. I walked into the workshop, ran my hand over the worn groove on the armrest of Silas's chair, and finally felt the house settle. He hadn't just left me wood and stone, he'd left me the truth. I opened the window to let the October air cycle through the rooms, and for the first time in 7 years, the squeak of the third step didn't sound like a repair I needed to make. It sounded like home. Silas Langford was a shipbuilder to the end. He'd made sure my keel was straight, and now, finally, the storm was over.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.